Hello friends, it's the Stitches, and it's been a hot minute since I made a garment for myself, and I decided that I just don't look nearly enough like I belong in a Madeline adventure from day to day, so today we're gonna have a sewing vlog. I've mentioned the Prairie revival a couple times on this channel now, and one of the brands associated with that style is Laura Ashley. So when I found this Laura Ashley pattern in my local thrift store some time ago, I definitely was not about to leave it behind. I love the massive sailor collar on the robe, so I've decided to modify it into more of like a tunic dress by nixing the belts and shortening the length to just above my knees. Shortening commercial patterns is usually pretty easy since the pattern companies tend to take the guesswork out of it for you. There should be two lines that run parallel to the grain line that have instructions that say lengthen or shorten here. This is the lengthen or shorten line. Fold the pattern along these lines after you identify them. You can subtract as much length as you want, but you must make sure that the grain line stays straight, or the resulting garment will just hang really awkwardly. If you're not sure how much you should shorten a pattern by, there are a few ways to decide this. The pattern envelope should have a finished back length measurement on it somewhere. You can use this to determine what the final length of the garment will be on you and where you want it to be on you, and then subtract the difference from the length in between the shorten and lengthen line. I just did it the lazy way, however. I just kind of taped it where it looked good and then measured the pattern and then measured my body and then decided to shorten it a little bit more. You'll notice now that our side seam line looks pretty messed up when we move the lines closer together, so as you've probably already guessed, we're going to have to transfer this to another sheet of paper. Before we start tracing anything, we just want to make sure that those lengthen or shorten lines are parallel to each other. I use at least 3 different points and make sure that each point has the same distance between the lines. I didn't film it, but I also had to shorten the front-facing piece in addition to the garment front and back. Make sure that the space between your parallel lengthen or shorten lines is the same for every single pattern piece. So the gap between the lines on my front piece was 5¼ inches, so the gap between the lines on my back piece should also be 5¼ inches, and the gap on my front-facing piece was also 5¼ inches. That way all of your pieces are shortened equally and you don't have any weirdness at your side seam. Once you're sure that the lines are completely parallel, then we can trace everything except for the part of the side seam that looks like it's been separated by millennia of continental drift. This is the part that we need to figure out how to connect. Using a regular ruler will result in weird angles and it'll just become very apparent that it doesn't work. It does, however, seem like you should be able to just throw down a yardstick and draw a whole new side seam, but that's actually also out of the question, as doing so would result in corners that don't meet at 90-degree angles. The points on your pattern must meet at 90 degrees to avoid puckering or awkward seam lines like bulging, bubbling, that kind of stuff. So we're going to use what's called a design ruler to draw some curves. You can also use a hip curve ruler or a French curve depending on your preference. We just want to draw a very subtle curve. This garment has a tent silhouette, so any dramatic hip curves are just gonna look weird, and honestly, I probably could have straightened this out even more. Repeat this process with the other pattern piece. We have one final measurement to check before our new pattern is ready. The side seam must be the same length on both pattern pieces or else they won't meet up correctly when you sew. I don't remember how long my side seams ended up being, but I actually managed to get them the same length on the first try, but you'll probably have to fiddle with it before it's perfect. Now we're actually ready to cut out our fabric. I'm using some lavender cotton that conveniently blends into my background. It's a little more prone to wrinkles than I like, but it's a decent medium weight. According to the pattern instructions, the robe is pieces 1 through 12, but since we're not making the belts because it makes it look too much like a robe, then we'll only need pieces 1 through 11. To prolong the life of my garment, I like to serge all of my pieces first before I start sewing them together. The pattern cutting instructions show a lot of piecing and different folding trickery, so I wasn't too surprised that I needed to piece my collar lining together. but since it is the lining, no one will see the seam that I had to add to center back. I also had to improvise with my facings a little bit. The back neck facing was the only piece that I noticed was missing from my secondhand pattern, so I just copied the shape of the neckline and made it the same width as the front facing, which I actually didn't have enough of my cotton fabric for, but luckily I had a thrifted pillowcase in my sewing stash that was close enough in color. The only interfacing the pattern calls for goes in the button placket, and I was a little apprehensive because I would usually add it to the collar and cuffs as well, but in retrospect, I'm glad that I went with the pattern instructions because the final garment would have looked too bulky with the extra interfacing, considering the weight of my fabric. I do, however, wish that I would have remembered to add the extra little bit of seam allowance for the pockets. It still works with the narrower seam allowance, the finished pockets just won't be as sturdy. To make sure that my pocket pieces line up, I measure how far down the side seam the pocket piece starts and use the same measurement for all of my pieces. When I stitch my pocket pieces down, I'm doing so just outside the serging. I like to press my seams open before I press them to one side or the other because it helps it lay flatter, but the seam allowance needs to be pressed towards the pocket. Now we're ready to stitch our side and shoulder seams. The pockets just need a tiny bit of finishing. The spot where the pockets meet the side seams gets clipped so the side seams lay flatter. And then the pocket seam allowance is tacked to the garment in the back to keep it in place while the tunic is worn. That way you don't have your phone causing like an awkward bulge on the side of your hip. Next, we'll stitch the two pieces of our collar ruffle together. This seam will act as the center back point on our ruffle. Now that the ruffle is in one piece, we'll fold it in half and press it in place. To prep it for gathering, we'll stitch 2 rows of running stitches close to each other in the seam allowance. Use the longest straight stitch setting on your machine and reduce your tension if necessary. And now we'll just gather the ruffle to fit the collar. Since I had to piece my collar lining, I conveniently have another clear center back point for matching. Then it gets basted in place before we stitch the collar lining to the collar itself. With all the bulk in this seam, we absolutely don't want to forget to clip our corners. And then the pattern doesn't call for it, but to control said bulk in the seams and to keep the collar looking crisp, I decided to run a narrow row of top stitching along the edge of the seam. Not the most dramatic of details, but I think it made a difference. Checking back in with our pattern, the next step is to attach our collar piece that we've just made onto our garment body that we stitched together earlier. Next, we'll stitch together our facing pieces. My seams on my facing pieces didn't wind up matching perfectly, but I did completely improvise the back piece, and I am also using two completely different fabrics, so I'm not that mad about it. Our pattern makes a note to finish the inside edge of the facing in our preferred way, but it's already serged, so we'll call it good. Now we'll use our facing to finish the collar area and the front of the garment, beginning by stitching it to our garment right sides together. And now here we gotta flip the facing into the garment. To help me get a clean edge, I've clipped some notches out of the curved areas. And then I used a small pressing ham to open up the seam allowance. Again, it'll be easier to press the garment pieces in place if the seam allowance is opened up and flattened first. Now the facing should flip into place with ease. We'll press and pin it and then give it a slightly chunkier top stitch than we gave the collar. One last finishing note the pattern gives us is to tack down the facing on the shoulder seam. I'm just pinning the seams together where they meet and then stitching a line perpendicular to the seam allowance. This prevents the facing from peeking out of the garment when it's worn. Now that the collar area is done, it's time to move on to the sleeves. I didn't do these next couple steps perfectly in order with the pattern, but we'll work some editing magic, so hopefully it makes sense. The pattern has us start by stitching the side seams on our sleeve pieces, as well as running some gathering stitches at the cuffs and between the marked dots on our pattern on our sleeve cap. Next, we stitch the side seams of the cuff pieces and the ruffles. After the side seams are pressed open, the ruffles are folded in half, much like the collar ruffle. And also like the collar ruffle, these will also get gathering stitches in the seam allowance. Both of our ruffles then get basted to a cuff piece after gathering it down to fit. In the same manner as the collar, we'll attach the cuff lining over the top of the now basted ruffle. The next part isn't super clear, either in the pattern or to look at it, but I'll try my best to explain it. With the iron, I have flipped up the cuff outer fabric, like the fashion fabric, the part that isn't the lining, and only that one layer. The cuff lining stays down inside the ruffle to keep it out of the way. The outer cuff fabric that got flipped up is then pinned to the wrist of the sleeve, which is gathered down to fit. Once the sleeve is gathered, it gets stitched into place. I hope that was clear. Next, we'll press the cuff in place and turn down the seam allowance on the cuff lining. This is pinned into place and then slip stitched. I'm doing my stitching just under the seam where the front of the cuff meets the sleeve, so that my hand stitching isn't visible on the outside of the garment. I suppose you could also secure it with top stitching, but that's not Laura Ashley approved, now is it? And here's just a quick look at our progress so far. Roughly cuffs. From here, our next step is to attach the sleeves to the armholes. I'll start by pinning the bottom of the sleeve to the armhole in the section where we won't be doing any gathering. Then the center of the sleeve cap is pinned to the shoulder seam. Gathering is so much easier when it's just one layer of fabric. This gets stitched and pressed as well. I'm waiting until the very end to stitch on my buttons, but I'll go ahead and do the buttonholes now. I use a baby lock machine and it makes buttonholes So easy. First, I set the size of the buttonhole by sticking the button itself into the back part of the buttonhole foot for my machine. I won't leave the button in for sewing, but the little mechanism on the back of the buttonhole foot needs to be set to the width of the button. Then I just set my sewing machine to the type of buttonhole I want and press one singular button, and it just does all the work for me. I'm using these vintage round buttons that I've had in my stash for a while, but seemed perfectly cartoony for this particular garment. I fiddled with the button spacing, but there was a guide on the pattern. I just decided roughly where I wanted my first button to go, and then I spaced them 3.5 inches apart, because the buttons I wound up using ended up being much bigger than what the pattern initially called for. Next, we use some fray check on the buttonholes and open them up very, very carefully with a seam ripper. You can also use that little chisel tool that they call a buttonhole opener as well, and I have one of those, but I think mine needs to be sharpened. I didn't do my hem exactly like the pattern either, but I don't know, it's a hem? You turn the fabric over, you turn it over again, and it's a hem. If you've even made it this far into the video, you probably know how to hem things. The very last thing this pattern has us do is make the little ties at the neck. The tie pieces are folded in half, pressed, and stitched similarly to how you would make a shoulder strap, but only one of the ends remains opened for turning. To turn this right side out, I'm going to use a bodkin. Yes, I finally bought a bodkin, and just kind of do my best. Shimmy it down the bodkin. And once everything is turned, we give it a good firm press. We're going to stitch it on with the tie going up towards the collar, and then we'll flip it down over and stitch it down over the serging to hide the edge of the fabric. And then I just sewed my buttons on while I was sitting on the couch, so after that, that's it, we're done. So we've taken this McCall's and Laura Ashley pajama pattern collab from 1985, and we've made this. I'm really pleased with how this garment came out. I think it's the perfect blend of elegant cute and cartoonish cute. I know this silhouette isn't everyone's cup of tea, but I personally love looking like a big purple potato, so I'm calling this a win. I love that it's loud and cutesy enough to make a statement when worn by itself, but it's also simple enough to be coordinated with other things. I can throw a skirt over it, I can throw pants over it, I can belt it, I can wear a dress over it. We love versatility. So that's all for today. I hope you enjoyed my 80s cartoon tomfoolery, and I hope everyone has a good day. I'll see you all next time. Bye!